I would like to take a few moments to discuss intimate partner violence as it occurs within the LGBTQ plus population and also among military families. These points come from the textbook readings that you've been assigned for this learning unit and also from some other sources that I referenced earlier in the semester in my presentations. Aside from the myths that surround the LGBTQ population that impacts all members of that population, the population of victims of IPV in this group also experience increased problems due to heterocentrism, homophobia, homonegativity, and all the other vulnerabilities that are associated with their lives. Heterocentrism is perhaps one of the most damaging issues for this population. That is, the organization of our society assumes that heterosexuality is the norm, and institutions and practices and behaviors and beliefs are all organized around the notion that if you're not heterosexual, there's something wrong with you. And this has implications that greatly impact victims in particular in IPV situations. Aside from all of the different tactics that batterers use in heterosexual relationships, batterers in the LGBTQ population also add a few other tactics that complicate life for the victims. One is the threats to out the victim. Another is the use of heterosexist ideologies to convince the victim that the abuse is mutual. This is something that not only occurs within the relationships itself, but also sometimes with the persons in the institutions that are responding to IPV, such as law enforcement and social workers sometimes as well. The assumption that women are generally passive, that aggression is a male characteristic, such things as that. There are also concerns regarding threats to infect a victim with HIV or to reveal the victim's HIV status to family and employers, and withholding necessary medication in sometimes life-threatening situations. There are other issues about understanding IPV for this population, and it's important to note that there really is a dearth of laws that acknowledge same-sex relationships, and this has a lot of complications when it comes to victims seeking legal protections in these cases. As far as studies go, prevalence data is obscured by quirks in recording, such as categorizing such violence as being between friends or acquaintances. This is something that I mentioned earlier in the semester in one of the other recordings when comparing perpetrators in cases involving female victims and male victims, if you'll recall. There's an entirely different way of identifying the perpetrators between the two genders, and this reflects this. And this was from some sources that are seriously studying this topic. Furthermore, the trans community itself is understudied at this time, and so there isn't really a lot of information out there that's reliable about IPV in this community. When LGBTQ persons contact police, it is oftentimes troubling to them in terms of how the law enforcement responds, and so they contact police far less often than heterosexuals do in IPV situations. They experience discrimination, the stigma, internal and external oppression, and fears of being outed because of going to law enforcement all have a role to play in this problem. If a person is marginalized due to gender identification, sexual orientation, and so on, and experiences other barriers based on intersectionality, such as race and age and class, those barriers may seem impossible to overcome and will only further discourage the victim from reporting. Female-to-female IPV victims elicit very little sympathy from the public, including, it's been shown, from mental health professionals as well. Male-to-male IPV victims often tend to elicit derision from public in that being a victim does challenge the traditional notions of what it means to be a male. Dynamics of both populations are often misunderstood. The notion that IPV somehow arises from patriarchal practices, this notion that men have a sense of entitlement and need to maintain power and control over their victims, this implies that lesbians should be free of these attitudes. And so a lot of times when you see reports of these incidents or descriptions of these incidents in legal papers or even in clinical reports, you'll see references to mutual combat between lesbians. Heterosexist thinking involves such things as an offender in a lesbian relationship needing to be butch, the victim femme. In both lesbian and gay relationships, that it is assumed that the individuals have an egalitarian relationship when that's not always the case. On the opposite of that, oftentimes it's assumed that there has to be a husband and a wife role played in these relationships. There's an assumption that homosexuals have low morals and that normal people are cisgendered and all of these kinds of things. This kind of thinking discourages individuals from reaching out for help. It's very important that as professionals intervening in these situations, we be sure that we're clear of these particular kinds of thoughts as we go about working with them. Turning to the clergy can also be problematic for LGBTQ parishioners. Pastoral counselors need to be educated about this population and need to examine whether or not they're in a position to be able to work with this population if their beliefs should somehow prevent them from doing so. Homosexuality as a particular mental illness was removed from the list of mental illnesses when the DSM-3 came out in 1973. The World Health Organization followed suit with this in 1981, removing it from its list of mental illnesses. And in 2015, the Supreme Court legalized same-sex marriage. This ruling seemed to institutionalize acceptance of lesbian, gay, and trans individuals in our society. But although the laws have changed, attitudes and many institutions have not adjusted to new thinking and practices in many sectors. A couple of examples include how at times LGBTQ persons are turned away in legal proceedings when applying for restraining orders against their abuser, and also the fact that there's a lack of shelter facilities for victims. And in the screening process, both in terms of clinical relationships as well as shelter advocacy relationships, sometimes there is incorrect identification of the victim and abuser status. And this is something which can be very harmful to victims in this population. Denial of the presence of intimate partner violence prevails in the LGBTQ community and also further challenges efforts to intervene in these situations. So when we intervene, it's very important that we understand the need for cultural competence when we work with LGBTQ persons. It's important for us to understand terminology used in the community, and the Peterson text actually has an updated list of these terms that is used within the community, and it's well worth your time to review this list and to be sure you understand how those terms are used in the community as you work with members of the LGBTQ population. Those working with clients experiencing same-sex IPV need to be familiar with LGBTQ-friendly resources and try to increase victim empowerment whenever possible. Practitioners should ensure that the victim is identified clearly and that the abuser is also identified clearly. Another area that is very important is to ask which pronoun the victim wishes to be called. A lot of times we make the assumption that an individual from this community is lesbian or gay, and it's worth the time to find out if indeed their gender identification is different from that. The services that we provide need to be tailored specifically to the LGBTQ population and their needs, and not necessarily following a heterosexual model for intervention in IPV cases. Lesbians in particular may experience difficulties feeling safe when they go to ordinary or typical domestic violence shelter environments because access can be easier for the female batterer because of being of the same sex. And so this is something that women's shelters will need to be very careful about when they arrange admission. Again, it comes down to the importance of identifying who's the victim and who's the batterer in these relationships. Challenging homophobic attitudes is similar to challenging racial discrimination. Initial changes begin with legal protections, and sometimes after that, attitudes in society begin to follow. So we should strengthen laws to address problems in the recourse for IPV and same-sex relationships as well. Law enforcement should resist the sense that same-sex violence is mutual combat, and this, again, tends to be something that is fairly typical in reports that we see. Many times both partners are arrested, and this further discourages the victims from reporting. Police training has to be improved so that same-sex couples have better protection and so that they understand issues related to IPV in this community. And as referenced earlier, survivors of color face additional barriers because of racism and bias from service providers on both counts. Transgender persons experience even higher levels than others in the community do. I'll move attention now for a few moments to take a look at the military and military families and IPV. Historically, IPV has been ignored in this field until more recently due to the bias against women in the military. But as more and more women have become involved in the military, this has become a more prominent issue. Studies conducted in the last decade have shown that there are elevated rates of intimate partner violence for both men and women in the military. And compared with non-deployed persons, those who have been deployed were usually more severely violent. The culture of hypermasculinity, the lower levels of support for female spouses, substance abuse among members of the military and their families, and higher levels of alcohol use all have an impact upon the connection between IPV and the military. As Peterson points out, some factors which probably contribute to the presence of IPV in military families include the prevalence of post-traumatic stress and depression among war veterans, the adjustment difficulties when deployment ends, intergenerational exposure to IPV among veterans and their families, and also the abuse of controlled substances. The prevalence of traumatic events among male and female veterans is referred to as high and extensive, and so post-traumatic stress disorder is a major concern in working with this population. Post-traumatic stress disorder is significantly higher in this population than among civilians. There are also a number of other factors that play into this, as you see here in prevalence data regarding members of the military, male and female, in terms of various issues involving sexual trauma in the military, male intimate partner violence, physical assaults, history of child sexual assaults and child physical assaults, and any other trauma. You can see that the prevalence there is quite high among this population. Veterans with post-traumatic stress disorder are significantly more violent, and severity is significantly correlated with partner abuse. When we work with this particular population, we need to be well versed in the treatment of post-traumatic stress disorder, the treatment of women with child sexual assault and or military sexual assault in their histories. We need to understand combat traumas and the impact that those traumas have upon veterans and their families. We need to understand and perhaps have some expertise in the area of alcohol and drug treatment, or to be able to refer to good resources if we are not adept in that area. And we also need to be aware of the fact that confidentiality, as is typically practiced in our profession, may not be available to military personnel except for chaplains. And it's important that you be aware of this and clarify these rules, particularly when you work on a military installation itself. We must target men with post-traumatic stress disorder and war zone traumas in our prevention efforts. Service members suffering from post-traumatic stress are more likely to become violent with their spouses, according to studies. Active duty personnel are more likely than civilian family members to be involved in physical abuse. And keep in mind, active duty doesn't mean necessarily those in deployment. This could be individuals who are not deployed but are still active duty. It's important also to watch for those triggers that seem to be the most frequent in cases of IPV among the military, that is marital discord and jealousy. There are programs that the military offers through the family advocacy programs, which exist in most all military installations. And the intent of those programs, among other things, is to prevent spousal and child abuse. Carol Ann Peterson spends quite a bit of time discussing these programs in her text, and I refer you to that work for more information in this area. Likewise, command can issue military protective orders that will, among other things, remove the rights of abusers to possess firearms, and will also restrict their ability to contact members of the family and their victims in situations involving IPV. But there is a particular complication sometimes as methods and rules and jurisdictional issues arise when there are a number of civilian authorities around the military installation, particularly if the IPV occurs off base. It's very important for civilian authorities to coordinate with military authorities so that it's clear who has what responsibilities and what actions they'll be taking in cases involving IPV with members in the community. While this quote particularly refers to working with the LGBTQ population, it can also be applied to the military population as well. And it's important to close this with just a few thoughts about this. That if we view all relationship violence as the same, then we run the risk of treating all cases of relationship violence as equivalent and interchangeable, when that doesn't seem to be the case. So it's well worth our time as professionals to be versed in the particular issues regarding IPV with these two populations, and as much as possible be prepared to effectively intervene in these cases. Thanks for your attention, and I hope that there's information that is useful to you. Please let me know if any questions arise from this talk. Thank you.